Continuing education knows that at the end of the day, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we really listen to their needs, and we can offer them flexible options both within continuing education and across the campus.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Thank you all for joining us today at the 78th Annual Conference on World Affairs here at CU Boulder. My name is Nancy Stevens. I'm a professor of anthropology and museum director here at CU, and I'll serve as the moderator for this session. Before I go on, can I get a thumbs up from the back of the room that you can hear me all right? Okay. All right. Is that better?
I think it would be a good idea.
Yes, thank you. Great.
The sound is coming from outside.
I think they'll close it later on probably.
So for the purposes of this recording,
Waiting for-
today is April 15th, 2026. The time is 2:30 p.m. And the title of this panel is Rewriting the Historical Narrative with Artifacts in Art. Now, before we get started, I will read CU Boulder's land acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it's located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, faculty, and their work. Educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating Indigenous knowledge. And consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. Thank you. Once again, welcome to CWA and today's discussion. Some housekeeping. We ask that all of our attendees remain respectful throughout the discussion and refrain from interruptions. Please silence your phones at this time. So time will be allotted for questions from our in-person audience. We will take your questions via handwritten note cards. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and a producer will give you a card and a pencil. Please print legibly, and then when you have a completed card, raise your hand and the producer will bring it to me. And now I would like each of our panelists to introduce themselves. Of course, the full speaker bios can be found online at the CWA website, and I encourage you to delve in and learn more about their fascinating work. So to begin, I'd like to ask you both to introduce yourselves and share with us the connection that brought you to CU Boulder today.
Yeah, I'm Pushpamala. I'm an artist who lives in Bangalore in India, so I've come here especially for the conference. I've been invited to speak here. I think my friend Alexis is behind this, who works in the University of Colorado. In fact, I was asked last year, but I couldn't make it, so I said I'll make it some other time. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for inviting me. Do we talk about the subject now? Or?
In a moment, I've got a few questions for you, but we'll let Guillermo introduce himself first.
Okay. I think this panel is about probably why both of us are here is because we both use certain kinds of references and objects in our work. We deconstruct them and reconstruct them. Rather than objects, I use a lot of historical images from art history and archaeology and several references from 19th century colonial disciplines. like ethnography and anthropometry in my work. But it's all about the present. That's enough.
Yes, thank you. Guillermo.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you to the conference for inviting me. The way I ended up here is a student probably saw my work on my website and approached me, and I'm very happy to be here. I've been having a great time. What I do is I'm trained as a classical composer, and I have made my way into the visual arts in some way or another, and to sound art, performance, and my work is approaches social justice, spirituality, and I'm a troublemaker, and I can't help it. I always was. So thank you for welcoming that personality of mine. But yeah, I'm gonna try to have a good conversation with my friends here.
Great, thank you. Well, maybe we'll start out by delving deeply into how some of the objects of the past and present tell the powerful stories in your work. So, Guillermo, your Border Cantos project uses art to explore and humanize complex issues surrounding the United States-Mexico border. Can you tell us a bit about your collaboration with a photographer colleague documenting this landscape, and perhaps share what gave you the idea about how to give voice to people through the personal belongings they left behind?
It's kind of a long story. When I started with the Border Cantos project, I was teaching ethnomusicology, and I realized that both the Mesoamerican people and indigenous people of the Americas didn't take the sound and music the way we take it in the Western culture. What happens is sound is a healing concept, and for example, the objects that surround you and the sound that they make can be healing to you. For example, if I have a sickness and there's a shaman that is taking care of me, they can plant a tree outside of your house, cut the branches and make a flute out of it, and since it's something that's surrounding you, it will heal you. And at the same time, I was listening to NPR, and I heard a story about objects that are left behind by immigrants that are either incarcerated or taken down, or they come back, or some of them died in the desert. And I thought that by using those objects and the sounds they make, I could approach the life of the people that brought them with them, because I believe in the fact that, in the concept that everything that surrounds you, your clothes, your glass, your toothbrush, everything is part of your journey and is connected to your journey through life. So instead of approaching those objects the way that we use traditional musical instruments in the West, which is you go to a tree or you go to something and you cut and you make a violin and you force the violin to make the sound that you want. This is the other way around. You make the object sound and you listen to what the object has to say. And from that I created the concept of imaginary stories, that the objects tell the story of the migrant. And it's very interesting talking about objects. I come from a musical background, and it was very interesting to find in the middle of the desert these cans and shoes and bottles or what have you, and take them to a museum where they were exhibited. And I see 5 people taking a broken can, all like rusted, and taking it like this, like a sacred object. And it's very interesting. It was like in the middle of the desert, rotting and full of dirt, and there's a museum. Thing. Or the other thing, no, about musical instruments, no? When you have a museum and you have a musical instrument behind the glass, it's not played. It's like if you have the indigenous culture behind the glass. There's spoons, there's everything, but nobody's eating, nobody's using it for anything. So it's kind of like having a Christmas tree to show how we Westerners celebrate something behind a window, no? All the Christmas is gone, but the Christmas tree is there. So you don't understand Christmas by seeing the Christmas tree behind the...
Yeah, when you remove the context.
Yes.
Yeah. That's beautiful.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So Pushpamala, you've described the process of evolving images from a photo shoot into a much larger and more imaginative project. Can you tell us more about how you leverage cultural memory and imagery of familiar architecture, buildings, train stations, or even painted backdrops to tell a familiar story, or conversely, to challenge a dominant narrative?
Yeah, well, I was trained as a sculptor actually, and some years later I started doing photo performance and video performance. I started performing in them, and I also started doing live performance. But from the beginning, my work has been very feminist, and I interrogate the idea of the nation and the place of women in the nation. So I use a lot of women's stories and women's images in my work. Not always so, because for the last 10 years I've started doing sculpture again. But what I do is I create sort of archives of images or objects. So I work, serially. I don't, rather than doing one large work, I do 100 things or 200 images or objects. So it's a sort of elaboration of ideas. I go on and on and on, elaborating ideas. So in my photo performance, I think I should start from my earliest work, which became very popular, and that was, I worked in terracotta because I felt it was a indigenous material. So there again, I was wrong because it's used all over the world, but I thought it was this kind of very native material. So I decided to do a whole series of works. This was in my MA course of a young woman growing up, of a young girl growing up to be a woman. And so it's like this, there's always a story, a kind of a storytelling. So even if they also work as disparate objects, but they also work as stories. And what I do is I layer the work with a lot of different references. So from art history, from theater, film, literature, and so on, all of which I'm interested in. And somebody, I think in one of the morning sessions, was talking about bringing all these areas together in one masterwork. It's in a way, it's trying to sort of, so different kinds of people actually respond to my work, and they think I'm to do with that discipline, And I also I'm interested in feminist theory and social sciences, and this whole idea of cultural memory, where there are certain things, even if you don't know about it, they're very familiar, So when you see something, it just immediately, the audience immediately feels a sense of recognition, even if they've never experienced that, because they're like sort of, iconic sort of experiences, or like cultural experiences. They're just floating around
in the background.
In society. So in a sense, like I'm constantly excavating these not only images but also emotions in my work. And very directly recently, I've been working with the archaeology because I suddenly decided to, every now and then I like to take on new kind of challenges, so I don't get what is the word? Too comfortable with my work. So I went to the local archaeological museum in Bangalore, and the first thing I saw was this vitrine with these very beautiful objects. They were copper plate records. They're called Tamra Shasanas. And they were actually historical records of land ownership or trade deals and so on. And they're very beautiful objects because they used to be buried in the ground, so they're full of different colored patinas and scripts. So I started working with that whole idea, and I created a kind of fake sort of archive of these objects, which have I use the ancient scripts, but they're all mixed up. And so it's called the Atlas of Rare and Lost Alphabets. So there are all these kind of lost alphabets from the past, and I made 100 of these objects. So it's, I use a lot of, people think it's nostalgic, but because I work a lot with 19th century, and it's also to do with the colonial period and the area of Indian nationalism. So, and the arrival of the camera. So there are a lot of things, disciplines that were created then, and I use a lot of references from them, sometimes deconstructing them, sometimes like using them directly.
That's fascinating. Thank you. So, you've both touched upon this, but I'd like to think a little bit more. As you both work across many different disciplines in media, it's important to remember that we all start somewhere, though, right? We all have these foundations underneath us. And so I wanted to hear you reflect a little about the creative pathway that brought you to your work today. Guillermo, you're a composer, and you construct visual sound experiences of so many kinds. Yet, how might some of your foundations, your early foundations in graphic design, inform how you actually engage with objects to create those meanings?
It's been a long path. My parents didn't want me to study music because I come from a family that sold pianos in Mexico, and they knew a lot of musicians, and they knew the stories of all the musicians that are not very happy. It's very hard to be a musician. But my parents told me to find something else that I could make a living of. So I studied graphic design. So I have a degree in graphic design and a degree in music. And I thought I was never going to use the graphic design. But I started experimenting with John Cage's graphic scores and things like that. And I started thinking that everything in our lives is a score, you know, like our date book is a score of our lives, and anything can be a score. Actually, a musical score is something that can be translated into sound, anything that can be translated into sound.
Yes.
So I explored the codexes of the Aztecs that are like literally scores that an accountant, that they are a poem, they are a song, and they are accounting of what is in the room. There was 3 tortillas in the room, and there was a turkey, and it's a poem, and you read it, and it has certain ways of reading it. So basically, it's all the translation of sound into graphics, graphics into sound, history into music, space and time. It's a translation of everything, and everything connects, no? Everything is connected all together. And coming from a family that sold pianos, I wanted toys like everybody else. I wanted like a G.I. Joe, and you know. And my parents gave me a box of piano parts. And they said, "These are your toys." It's like, how am I gonna do it? So that was a very interesting lesson, because that's what I'm doing now. I pick up stuff and make up things out of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's the true creativity of breaking across disciplines, or
Exactly.
that surprise of what an object can reveal.
Exactly.
And so, Pushpamala, along similar lines, you shared your background in sculpture. And I wonder if shaping clay in that way over time has helped you to combine and knead together the literature, theater, film, photonovellas, photo romances, and all of that. And I just wonder how those foundations in sculpture could inform how you explore art forms outside of the mainstream of photography, even, you know, like how you leverage images not just to document things, but rather to create works of imagination and fiction.
Yeah, the thing is, what I found was that I was an insider in sculpture, but when I started doing photography, I was an outsider. So I was completely free, you know, I didn't have to follow the rules.
Right.
And at that time in India, what was happening was that it was documentary photography. So it was, everyone was, you're doing black and white photography, and with a certain kind of, using only natural light, and so on. So there was these strict rules, you know, what was good photography. But I'm very interested in the histories of photography, because it starts with studying botanical. There's medical photography. The X-ray is also a photograph, and then there's ethnographic photography. Photography has been used in so many different ways. You know, I mean, I think the earliest photographs were of botanical, botanical photographs. So I'm into, and then I love the photo studio. So it's a construct, it's a fictional thing where you construct your personality. So all these things were supposed to be lower forms, which I got very interested in. So I painted photograph, for instance, and so on. So I started using all these, and the photographers still hate me till today. So, in fact, I was the curator of an international photo festival, and I faced so much hostility, because they said, how does this woman, like, who's an outsider to the field, I don't even photograph. So I work with photographers, because I perform in the photographs in my own work. So I direct photographs. It's something like a filmmaker, like a film director or something like that. So I work with different kinds of, sometimes they're amateur, just friends, or sometimes they're professional photographers and so on. So it's all like, it's not at all acceptable to the photography community, Yeah, and another thing people have noticed about my work is that it's very sculptural. So I build a set. So it's like I use painted backdrops, and that's of course comes from theater, but also from the traditional photo studio, which always use painted sets and sceneries, and either interior or exterior, and then there were props and costumes. Some of the photo studios even used to have costumes, stock costumes. And then I'm very interested in lighting. Actually it comes from film, but the traditional photographers do not like. They think only ambient light should be used or natural light. So this using of these film lights they don't like. Right. So, but what happens is that people have said that the work it's very sculptural. The way I create these scenes. I don't know whether it's completely true, because if you see all the work, there's different kinds of things happening. But from the very beginning, I've used these kind of quotations from different sources, and that's one of the ways I make the work more complex, so that it's not just one thing, and you can read many different things in the work.
Yes. And so in that layering, just to follow up on this for a moment, when we think about your creative process, there's the part of that process that involves research, right?
Yes.
And how do you balance that sort of research and construction of the costumes and props with the improvisation that you want to create along the way?
Yeah, they do two different things, because production is one thing, research is another thing.
Right.
So research goes on for a long time sometimes. Something's at the back of my head. I keep reading stuff about it. I keep collecting pictures and images, reference things and all that. But the production usually takes 2 or 3 months. It's elaborate. It depends. But if sometimes the photo romances I've shot on location outdoors. So there I don't have to create a set. Whatever is there, I use, and create a story. It's in a way site specific, because it comes from whatever's there. I make the story up from that. But the actual shoot takes, just a few days, either one day or a few days. So that's the least part of it. And then the post-production, in the sense I sit with the printer, and I do a lot of test prints and all that, and I'm very particular about printing as well. Or in terms of video, I take a long time to edit. Editing is very, very important, because you can shoot any old thing, but you can make it a work of art in the editing process.
Sure.
So,
yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yeah. So I think for both of you, it seems like your work is intensely personal, but also intensely collaborative. You work with other creatives, with other modalities, whether it's photographers, musicians, animators. And so that layering of the creativity and the creative process and the community of creativity. Can you explain a little bit how you choose your collaborators? We'll start with Guillermo on this one, and how they help you bring your ideas to life, and how do your collaborations evolve over time?
Yeah, I find Pushpamala work very inspiring, very connected to my work, and I'm pleasantly surprised. I just met her yesterday. And there's so many things. I forgot to mention that my border cantos is with photographer Richard Misrach, and he's the one that invited me to collaborate with him. I was already making my cyber totemic sonic objects, and he saw me perform somewhere, and he said, we can make this project that is going to be all over museums all over the world, and you don't imagine. And here we are. This started in 2017, and the project is already moving around. It's still moving around through Crystal Bridges and through other museums. But several things. No, you were talking about collaboration. My work always has been in collaboration, either with poets, with Michael McClure, with Ann Carson, with Guillermo Gomez Peña, performance artist, and finally with Richard Misrach, that was an incredible person that helped me so much to have visibility in this in the art world. And what I found very interesting about Pushpamala's setting is that I also go to a setting. No, there's a setting where some immigrants were, and there's a fire, and there's backpacks, and there's bottles, but there's nobody there. So it's like you go there and you're kind of recreating a scene, and you're trying to imagine what happened there. How long did they stay here? Were they caught? Did they go somewhere else? Why do they left some things behind? What do they left behind, and what do they take with them? And it's a story, it's an imaginary story. And the characteristics with Richard's photographs is that we're all only photographing scenes, and my sonic instruments are the objects, but we never see humans. So it's left to the viewer or to the listener to recreate the story with things that we use every day. You know, there's a toothbrush, there's some shoes, there's some socks, and it's things that we identify. So what we're doing is putting the audience into the scene and experiencing the things by themselves.
Thank you.
I think that's a
Yeah, thanks a lot. So what other artists do you know who transform cultural objects in these ways to tell visual stories, or in some cases, musical stories? And how have they had an impact on your work?
It's very interesting if I talk about, for example, John Cage. He has a piece in which he uses normal objects, no, like a blender and a toaster. And I thought of John Cage, well, what if I was John Cage, but a Mexican John Cage, no? Yeah. So instead of making a bunch of like blenders and things make sound, what I'm doing is a ritual that has instructions to make this ritual happen, no? That's how I approach my ritual objects. And Cage was definitely an inspiration, and also all the conceptual art is very interesting, because I come from in Mexico there was first the nationalistic art that Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo and all of that, the art of the revolution. And then came in the 60s the conceptual art, the people that studied in France and Paris and came up with conceptualism and Fluxus and all of that stuff. And these were my teachers. So my question was like, it's not either like being political or being abstract, it's the two things. So when in Documenta 14, I brought a wreckage boat that I found in the island of Lesbos and turned it into an enormous sound object. You see the broken boat and you go, oh, this is conceptual art. But when you go deeper, you see that it's a boat where many people probably die in the sea. So it's giving meaning to something that at the beginning can become abstract, but it has meaning. So it's a combination of both things.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. So, Pushpamala, what are your influences as well, and other artists that transform cultural objects into visual art or visual stories, and/or maybe just tell us about your collaborations? How do you choose your photographers and your other collaborators?
I don't actually. No, I went to an art school which had a lot of emphasis on art history. So I did about. I did 7 years of art school, and throughout, like I think I almost studied as much art history as an art history specialization student. So there was a lot of kind of emphasis on knowing about your context. That is also knowing about your context, where you come from, and being able to analyze and to look at things in historical perspective. So I grew up in that, and I think my teachers, some of them like Ghulam Sheikh, they were very influential, and there's also a lot of interest in pop. So in the popular, so we were always looking around, and I'm very interested in using humor, wit and humor in my work. So that again comes from my background as a student in Baroda, and I think some of the artists over there, like they were using the popular and then humor, which are kind of seen as not high art but low art, using these references. So that was, and of course, it also sort of connected to the pop movements
Yes.
in other parts of the world. But this also had a kind of twist, a very Indian twist, because as you know, there's a lot of very rich popular culture in India. So I constantly use all these elements, like art history in my work, or like these cross-referencing and humor, popular images, and so on. So the collaboration is not, sometimes I choose the collaboration and specifically go for collaboration. Sometimes I just work with whoever's there, Because I've worked in different parts of India and different parts of the world, and especially this performance, photography. And also several of my early works were done in what are called, artist workshops and residencies. So whoever was around, I would say, look, I'm going to come running up like this and pause over here, you click, So it was not really collaborative. It was like somebody would be doing the job, And sometimes, like I've actually asked, when I was doing very recently, I've started doing live performance, sort of recently. And so I asked a friend of mine who's a well-known Kannada poet to respond to this image I had in my head. And we did a half an hour sort of performance together, So it depends on, I would say sometimes it's co-authors, there are different kinds of collaboration, Sometimes collaboration is just like, say, I work with a printer, and I think it's very important. Because you can take any old picture, and then the printer, in the printing, you can make it make it work, or you can shoot any old thing, and then in the editing the video, you can, or the film, you can make it something really interesting, So they're all equally important, and but they're not authors, So sometimes it's a kind of collaborative authorship, and sometimes it's actually working with a group of people like they do in theater or film. Where there's so many different people. Like, for example, sometimes I paint the backdrop, but usually I'm not a painter. So I ask some friend or somebody, like sometimes a commercial backdrop, cinema hoarding painter, for instance. I had a whole project where I worked with them. But it's, I don't know, it's sort of collaborative, but it's collaborative in the sense of what happens in theater or film. It's not really co-authorship. So it's different kinds of ways in which I work with people, And sometimes it's actually collaborative, but the person doesn't want to say they're a co-author, even though I've offered them this thing, Of course, the idea would be mine, but say I worked on a film with a very good editor. And in fact, he gave me so many ideas. I didn't know, that was the first time I was making a video. It was quite long. And he was giving me so many different ideas because he's film school trained.
Yes.
And even with as far as editing went, but also in terms of how to structure the film and so on. See, finally, all the decisions were mine. But in fact, I asked him, I said, do you want to say it's, it's both our film? He said, no, I want to get I want only the editor's, this thing, credit. So it depends. In fact, like, but the thing is, because he's film school trained, I told you this whole advantage of being an outsider. Because I'm not film school trained. So I have no rules, I do any old thing and make it work. A filmmaker would never do something like that, someone trained in film school. Because they have a classic sense of what a film should be like. It's very difficult for them to break it. Like for him, like, he wanted to, and these people are very funny. He wanted to try all kinds of crazy things with me because they think, this one is an artist, and they can have fun experimenting, But he's a filmmaker himself. He will never do that kind of experimentation in his own film. It'll be a very, classical sort of narrative sort of film, because I've seen his films, So it has nothing to do with how he works with me, because that's to do with me. So it's a very complicated thing, but we are both learning from each other. We all learn from each other,
The emergent properties of collaboration. Yeah. And I'm wondering also, through your collaborations, Guillermo, with, say, Christoph Segar, who animated the scenes in your sonic biogenesis project. How, for the musical scores, your musicians, it was Andrew and Travis, right? Your musicians were playing percussion and guitar in those scores. Were they playing everything exactly, or were they also improvising? And to what extent was Christoph improvising in his animations?
Yes, I believe in this thing that is called controlled improvisation. That is not free improvisation. I believe that in order to make art, you need some rules. And in order to be creative, you need rules. Because if you have all the universe at your feet, then you don't know where to start. But if you say, you have these two sticks and just make any sound that you can make with these two sticks, people start becoming creative then. So my musicians have a score in which they can do this and that, and they cannot do this and that in this frame of time. So usually the scores are not broken in measures like traditional music, but in timing with a stopwatch. And there's frames of times where things happen or they don't happen, and it's up to the performers to decide. And I find that a very beautiful way to work, and a very giving agency to the musicians to do something of their own, It's like live, like scoring live, no? You grab what you have and you use it at the moment. If not, the moment is gone, It's you just are in the moment. That's it. That's all you can change, the moment. So that's my idea of improvisation
with
and
creativity.
Music. Yes.
Yeah. So I'm going to follow up on that a little bit more, Guillermo. Your work interrogates how from Columbus to Darwin and beyond, scientists have cataloged flora and fauna, right? Through colonial and religious filters, with life forms just seen as commodities. And then you have this beautiful ethno-futuristic project, Sonic Biogenesis, and you imagine this future. It's post-human. It's a bit dystopian, but it's also a bit happy too when you see the animation. It's hard to quite discern that where nature has basically responded to human alterations. I would love to hear you describe more of your process on these genome scores that you wrote, the graphic representations of musical compositions and artwork that merge the textures of plants and animals and microbes.
I'm gonna follow Pushpamala in that I like to have a sense of humor in what
Yes.
I do. So what happened is the Getty Foundation for the Pacific Standard Time Biennale, they asked me to comment on an exhibit that they have of codexes, of pre-Columbian codexes or European codexes. And the codexes were the way that Europeans classify the plants and the animals and everything they found in the New World, to send it back to Europe and say, like, look how weird this is, and look. And then it worked as a form of exploitation of the environment, exploitation of the wood, exploitation of everything. So they told me to comment in this exhibit that was holding the codexes. And I kept thinking, what would be the new application of that? And I thought of the genome, no? The owning of genetics and working with genetics and appropriating the genetics of corn or whatever, what have you. And then it evolved into be a project of thinking of the future as non-human, and all of these things that we created, all this genome, evolving into something better than humans. No? That it's a combination between humans, reptiles, plants, and it's a symbiotic world that is post-human, in which nothing has a hierarchy over anything else, and everything is perfect. And it's a kind of a combination between the Utopia, Thomas More Utopia, Marx work, and Alice in Wonderland. It's kind of like, and also it's an ideal of what I think of my transformation as queerness, no? Queerness in the world, no? All being equal, no? Not being like man is superior or woman is superior. Everything should be equal and horizontal, no? I do believe in horizontal way of seeing the world. Mm-hmm. And it's a metaphor, no? All of my creatures and all of that are a metaphor of how could we have a new life and a new planet after we screwed up so many times.
Thank you. I love that you use the term symbiosis. So both of you have touched upon, the categorization of objects and how humans see the world. And I think, we can think about how research and data and how the historical expressions of that have expressed and sustained different systems of power, right? And particularly related to colonialism and imperialism and all of it. How can we reimagine the power of research for connection and for public good in similar ways that, or we could say, how could we imagine creativity in the service of public good?
I think, I'm getting a bit dystopian, So I don't know what public good. I think one of the ways, I'm working is to bring certain things to the fore, these kind of cruelties and injustices. Like, I'm very interested in the Human Genome Project. Actually, and this, of course, I've been using classification and, in my work with, what's been going on with 19th century anthropology and anthropometry and all that. And I'm very interested in eugenics. And if you see what's going on today, ethnic cleansing. And this Human Genome Project is very interesting. I've been reading about it, and that actually has some interesting, positive things about it. But one of the things, because it sort of destroys your ideas about race, and in India, things like caste and also, different regions, North Indians and South Indians and all that, because when you actually, study the genes of people, which they're doing now, and in a way, it's a kind of extension of what happened, but it's a very different way of dealing with the material. You find that everything is mixed up. All the races are actually mixed up because there are different kinds of, these genes are found. These, they're not pure. So that's one of the positive things that maybe if people got to know, because it's so kind of divisive, the world, that actually we are all very closely related to each other, and we all came from Africa anyway, and went here and there. Which people don't realize. But I think it's a lot of my work has to do with deconstruction, and so that's one of the ways in which I want to point out certain things that people don't know, about, and certain kinds of, and which are still continuing in government policies or in our own sort of skewed sort of visions of the world, including oneself, and it's shocking to see how within oneself also there are these skewed perceptions. And as I keep sort of reading and looking at things from, to make work, I discover so many things.
Yes, you've described how your work enables you to enter the skin of another person sometimes.
Yes, yeah.
And yet you never know how that other person thinks. Can you share a bit about how you enjoy sort of becoming the other through your art, and then also still remaining yourself and true to yourself?
That actually I wrote in my MA dissertation about getting into the skin of another, which is actually very interesting, because at that time I was doing sculpture. I had no idea that I'd be doing, photo performance and all that, and performance later on. I think I was just thinking of my mother, who was an amateur actress. Now, these people's lives at that time were quite limited, because she, this morning I attended this session about trad wives, and I think there were these trad wives at that time, and they couldn't really do public things in public so much, even though the Indian, nationalist movement did bring out a lot of women into the public sphere. Most women were still inside their homes. So, but she loved to, she was an amateur actress, So the way we were brought up, my brother and I were always dressed up as something or the other, and there would be some plays or fancy dress or something like that. Or there'd be these tableaus for different festivals, for instance. We'd be dressed up as gods and goddesses. And those are the kinds of references I use in my work. And one day I was having this discussion with someone. He said, why did these people do that, you know? And a lot of the roles she played were male roles because she was taller than the other women, you know. And even on radio, she was playing a male on radio, even like, because even that, there was this kind of, this thing, you know, all-female kind of programs. And I just realized it's a way of getting beyond the limitations of one's life, you know. I mean, there it was that, I'm absolutely free, I think, compared to that. But you're still stuck within your own skin and your own history and your own kind of, physicality. And I think when you, maybe the fun of playing different roles, and everybody likes this role playing. And that's one of the things which I like about the photo studio or whatever, you know, like you go in there and you pose as somebody, and people do it all the time, and with props and all that. And or there are different ways in which, you want to sort of get outside that limitation of yourself. I mean, I don't know. I think it's too utopian to say that you understand something else. And there are a lot of problems also. See, for example, I've played tribal role of a tribal. And at that time, I'm quite sort of politically conscious, so I did my due research, and there was no problem. I mean, there's a problem with blackface, but not with brown face. I mean, I'm the same race, except I was, made up darker than I was. But recently now with the Dalits, that Dalits are the lowest caste in India, and there is a movement against this brown face. So they don't want higher caste people to play lower caste. It's also, though I've not been criticized, I've not been attacked. I've shown this work everywhere because it's this kind of whole series called the ethnographic series. So I don't know, there are different things happening, and one is also trying to, one has to be a little careful also in this role playing.
I think, you're thinking about empathy and, versus portrayal. I mean, I think that there are some things to think about there. We do have some questions from the audience that I would love to share. So Guillermo, when you say sound objects, what does that look like to a viewer? Are they interactive, or is it a performance? Is there an audience group that your work is directed at?
Well, the sound objects kind of look like musical instruments. Some of them are inspired musical instruments, but they're a combination like a bottle, a shoe, a toothbrush. I mean, it's kind of a sculpture at the same time, that it's a sonic object. I don't call it a musical instrument or an instrument because it's not necessarily a musical instrument. It's a talisman to enter another dimension. No? Like Mircea Eliade, they used to say a church or a temple is a place where you enter another realm and you go away from daily life and enter a communication with the spiritual and with God or whatever, or goddess. So that's the function of these things. They are not like to make beautiful music or to make anything. But the interesting thing is, before that I was doing academic music, which is very rigid, and I come from teachers that were encouraging the dissonance and the not caring too much about the audiences and all of that. And I started like following my teachers and doing that music. And then I found this thing about doing my own instruments and ritual and all of that. And I make the same music with the same objects. And the music that they told me, this is hard to understand. Now everybody's like, wow, I saw the jaguars in the desert, and I saw the people walking through the stars. And it's very funny because it's a matter of framing something. I mean, it's the same sounds, but you're framing them in a different way.
In a different narrative.
In a different narrative.
Yeah.
And I would quote my favorite composer, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, that they told me in a conference. He said, a shoe that you find in the moon is not, a tennis shoe that you find in the moon is not the same tennis shoe that you find in the trash can. I mean, if you find a tennis shoe in the moon, it's like, whoa, even if it's like all beaten up.
That's funny. I mean, you were talking a little bit this morning about how to make creativity and academic music less elitist and more available to the broader community. And I was wondering how you elevate experimentation and how you could perhaps leverage third spaces like museums to provide that narrative or that storytelling component that makes it more legible.
Yes, definitely. I think a lot about the spaces.
Yeah.
I don't like to be in a concert hall in the stage. It's ridiculous. I want to be at the level of the people with my table, and people can walk around and see what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I believe, like I said before, I believe in horizontality. I don't believe in prosceniums or like things that are above or anything. I can even have in a room things happening simultaneously in different places with no center of attention.
Yeah.
And those things I took it from performance art and from alternative fluxus techniques and theater techniques and all of that. I think it's very important to take away the center of things, to make everything more horizontal.
Yeah, yeah, the connections. And that ties in with another question from our audience. Can you talk about how your audience can engage with your work? And we can start with
Oh, sorry, you're talking.
Jamala. Yes.
Sorry, what?
How can your audience engage with your work?
Oh, I have fantastic audience response, by the way. It's always very amusing because they get confused between, I have these narratives, so as I said, I use these kind of archetypes, archetypal figures and these popular sort of stories and cliches and, so people get completely involved in it and they sort of identify with it. So whenever I have a show like, or show my work, like I have this very strange sort of interesting response. Like, for example, I think I showed this work called Phantom Lady or Kismet, which is about this, I play this Zorro-like figure, who has an adventure in the city of Bombay. And this elderly lady came for the opening and no one knew her and she was there for 2 or 3 hours staring at the work. And I had actually, it was in a gallery and I had exhibited the clothes and as well as notes for my work, so it was like a museum show. So she wanted to buy this kind of very cheap evening gown I'd made for the Vamp. There's a Vamp there, and she said, I want to buy that. So she completely identified herself with that figure, which was actually taken from, Hindi films and like, typical sort of cigarette smoking, westernized vamp with this kind of, evening gown and all that. So it's very funny. Then another thing, during another show, I had this response in which this young boy, he kept asking me, I had made this kind of story of these 2 sisters and a man. The elder sister has this romance with this man, and there's this younger sister also, like, kind of carrying messages and so on. So he kept asking me, why is that younger sister there? So I said, no, she's this kind of, I couldn't have just 2 figures, so there's one more figure there to give some depth to the story. And for 2 hours, he was wandering around looking at the work. Then again, he comes up to me and said, you know why I asked you that? Because my father married 2 sisters. So it's very strange, He saw this second sister, the younger sister, as a sexual figure, and which I never saw her as. So they're very strange kind of responses because I use these kind of, these narratives which are popular in, what is called cultural memory.
Right.
And they're sometimes like, they're so cliched that everybody can get into them. And then again, I've done this goddess Lakshmi, and the minute, just after the shoot, my photographer, she made a small print and she put it in a, photo frame and put it on her mantelpiece. And she had this lady, who was cleaning lady who came. And the next morning she found that she'd put a kumkum and some flowers around it. She started worshipping it. So, and this, actually several people have told me, my Lakshmi, they found it in different, they said they went to a friend's apartment block and the watchman over there, doorman over there, had this in his cabin. me as Lakshmi, you know. He was worshipping it. So there are very strange things that happen, you know. And
How people interact.
yeah, talking about public art, so public art is not only some sculpture or something that you do in the public, but the way these images circulate,
They have a
is
life
also
of their
public
own.
art. Yeah.
Yeah, they have a life of their own. So we have a question from a student. How can young artists use historical context to develop art and works to call attention to social issues? And you know, this is close. This is somewhat dovetailing with a question that I had for you, which is knowing what you know now. What advice might you give to your younger self or to someone earlier in their career?
I would say break the rules. I mean, try to see things in a different way. You know, we go through this life seeing things the same, following the rules, doing everything, and we're too much close to what to do and how to see things. You know, I tell my students, "What is this?" and they say a glass. I said, "No, this is my sister." Or, or you start seeing things. It's a very fulfilling thing to step out of reality and start seeing things with imagination. No? I think that's the best. I mean, the greatest thing about doing art, I think, is like facts don't matter. Mm-hmm. You don't have to be factual. You can invent whatever you want. So that's what I did with science, with my project, no? Mm-hmm. A biologist can come to me and say, "Oh, this is not possible because this and that." That's not possible for you, but it's possible for me.
I love that.
Yeah.
How about you? What would you tell your younger self or an aspiring artist today?
I would tell my youngest self, don't think so much, make a lot of art, you know, because we just ponder and then we get so, nervous that we don't do anything. And even now, like, I just have to force myself to work because I'm so nervous, like, you know, that I'd make an ass of myself. I mean, of course, I'm more confident now, but you just have to, just keep on working and the materiality solves the problems, you know. And then I would say just be interested in a lot of different things. Of course, it's confusing at first, but you also have to limit yourself, you know, and say you can't do the whole world. You have to, as you said, there are some rules or, I mean, rather like, you know.
Some constraint.
Constraints. Put some constraints on yourself, but I think like, for example, I mean, you have to read. You have to see theater, you have to see film, you have to be in touch with the progressive thinking of the day, basically. So you have to, know everything that's going on. You can't just make art like that, you know. That will sharpen your, you have to sharpen your wits, actually. And that study is, I think, very important.
And maybe just a bit more on how to help call attention to social issues, which is, I think, what inspired that question.
How do you?
How would you recommend a young student begin using art to call attention to social issues?
I think you have to do what you really believe in and what you know about, you know. Because I find this is nonsensical. Because I find a lot of young artists in India doing something on environment. You have to know all the politics of environment. You know, before you start doing something on, like, you know, if you have sentimental stuff on chopping trees or something like that, you know, and that's at the level that a lot of people work. I mean, it's here, like, for example, in India, you have these things where, there are native populations, you know, like living in the forests who are nomads and they are displaced because, a paper factory has to, like, you know, they want to cut all the trees. So environment is, and then they are given, there are rules that they cannot cut the trees. They have been living there for thousands of years, you know, and they cannot cut the trees, but a paper factory can come and buy up that whole land and cut all the trees, you know. So unless you know all the politics of that thing,
Systems.
please don't even try, you know. Don't even try to make political statements because you have to know what you're talking about. And some things are so like that it's laughable, actually, some of the stuff that people come, because there's some trendy things, you know. And then those trendy things are just followed without proper thought. You have to study the whole thing properly and
to be substantive, to have an understanding of system.
you have to know
and
what's going on.
where in the
actually.
system to intervene. So, you raised the concept of commodities and, nature. So I think we talked a little bit this morning about the importance of centering objects not as commodities, but rather in service of ideas. So as we're creating art, as we're being creative, how do we do that? How do we position objects in art to shift them away from being viewed as simply something to sell, but a tool for expressing creative ideas and rewriting those historical narratives? What do you think, Guillermo?
Yes, definitely the art as commodity is a product of capitalism. And I mean, it's kind of although my art has been in art fairs and all of that, I can see that the substance of expression is kind of going away in this kind of like using art as a commodity and as a object of luxury and an object of status. I mean, the example is also very good. If I find a can, a rusty can, that I make into a sonic object in the California desert that belonged to an immigrant, I mean, it changes completely when you take it to a museum, no? It becomes completely another thing. And I find that fascinating, no? Like the value of something that we take for granted, how it can change depending on how you frame it, no? And the significance of that thing. So in order to approach social issues, you don't have to be like a politician. You don't have to be Republican or Democrat or whatever. Those are, I mean, that's not valuable for me. The language of art is a lot stronger than that and a lot more significant than that. We don't talk at that level. It's primitive. We speak at another level, at the level of imagination, of inclusion. I mean, we're not interested in votes or in, I mean, it's like we believe that being political is being didactic, But there's so many ways of being political. Everything is political, by the way. So art is a language that is so beautiful and extensive that you can approach things that are common problems in a very different way and present them to people in different ways. So I don't know. That's why.
Well, thank you. I think people are interested in knowing what inspires you now and what you're working on next. And to that end, we have a question from the audience, or maybe a wish. I would love for Guillermo and Pushpamala to imagine a collaboration project together. What might that look like?
Maybe that'll be interesting. He wants to come to India, and I'm trying to persuade him to come there.
I'm turning red.
For some time, yeah.
I'm turning red. I'm blushing.
No, I think I'd like to say something about this whole commodification. I think there's too much anxiety about it because everything is a commodity anyway. It can be seen as a commodity. But one of the things, like my thing is that I do so many different things, Like many of us do. Like we work in the mainstream as well as outside. Yeah. I organize a lot of things. I'm a writer and curator as well. I organize talks, I organize seminars. I've just edited a book which has been published. I've written another monograph which is going to be published. And so I'm also an activist and I intervene in many different ways. So I think several of us do this, So it's not that one is just this mainstream artist, you criticize, you exhibit in galleries and blah, blah, and all that. And that's one of the things one also does. But one also does works with, your own community of artists. We organize so many things. We've been for years, we've been part of this protest against the privatization of the local, the State Art Gallery in Bangalore, in my city. And we won, and then we've got it renovated and rebuilt. So so many things are going on. You can do many things simultaneously, which cannot be called a commodity or cannot be called this or that. So you can intervene in the public sphere in so many different ways, intellectually as well as, so many ways, can change things.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And not unexpected with the way that both of you cross disciplines. But back to that collaboration, what might that look like? It might involve mixing different media, perhaps. Might involve some sound.
No, he was said something very interesting when we were chatting when I first met him, that he was talking about the East Coast and the West Coast, and how composers on the East Coast were more kind of formal and they connected to Europe, while the composers on the East Coast actually connected to different kinds of music, like Latin music or different kinds of, black music and so on. Then I said, oh, Ravi Shankar was in California. Then he said, yes, I went and I studied with Ali Akbar Khan. He had a school there. These legendary Indian, musicians were in California. So it's actually interesting connections.
Yes,
Yeah.
you're right.
So you didn't talk about that influence in your work. How did learning Indian music influence whatever your
I
your
love
thoughts?
Indian
Yeah.
music. It's like the concepts behind Indian music, especially rhythm. It's like rhythms nested in other rhythms, So it's like a whole world, but you can go inside and go into very, very detailed thing. And the tunings, I played with a sarod player, I told you, that also studied with Ali Akbar. And when we start trying different tunings, it was like tasting food with different spices that you never tried. It's like, what is this? Like this, I never heard this before. So that's a very big influence. And spirituality, like the meditation and the drone, and the concept of Indian music. I don't know if this is true, but my friend told me that this is true, that if you go an Indian music concert, there's like several people and nobody's advertised. So you keep playing and playing, and no matter where you show up, you don't show up to see somebody, but it's the moment that you have to be there and listen to that part of the music. Is that true? I'm like, like you enter a place and the music that is playing is the music that you have to listen.
No, there are ragas and this thing, like they have a duration and they have a kind of progression. Actually, I'm not a great music person, but there's it's a kind of concert is, it starts, for example, these ragas are to do with times of day. So, for example, there are night ragas and there are morning ragas and all that.
And tunings.
Afternoon ragas, and then they're also to do with the seasons. So that's also very interesting, that during the rainy season you might go to hear certain ragas and the musician will play those or sing those, and during the winter they'll be different, and during the summer they might be different, and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, my friend
There's
tells me things like,
There's a structure.
I'm gonna
to it, yeah.
play a tuning that is only for when the sun is coming up. And I said, okay, let's see what you can do with this.
No, it's lovely going to an early morning concert, actually.
Yes.
So, yeah, because it's, I haven't gone to such an early morning one, but like 7 o'clock concert. So the early morning ragas, they sing there. So,
This morning, you mentioned something about how the transformation that occurs when music and art become more of a communal experience with people experiencing it together. And I think we've probably all experienced that at some time. Could you maybe share how you use this phenomenon to explore social justice or spirituality and community?
I've been doing these performances, I call it transonic communities, and they are performances and workshops with people that are not musicians. And I started with chanting. There's big, it's a 3-day workshop, and I tell people about resonance, about reverberation, about using the space as an instrument. And they are chanting. They started with chanting. Now I have done a lot of residencies with students in which we explore, for example, we go to a historical site and we unearth the sounds of that, like bringing back the moments of history. It's very similar to what you do in a way, like you're unearthing the sound, you're taking it out.
yeah.
And it's also it's also for people, common people. I'm doing one in Flagstaff a month from now in an art festival. It's called Artex, and I'm doing a 3-day workshop for chanting. And it's very interesting, like they were saying this morning, no? Sometimes you find yourself in this net of sound in which you are just a part, but your part is as important as anybody else. Mm-hmm. And it's a metaphor for society. It's a metaphor of how everything should be, you know, where everybody is important. There's no one more important than anybody else. And you see it with chanting. I mean, that's why since the caves, we sing in the caves, we sing in the churches, the resonance of our voice and the community doing something together is a very uplifting energy, and it's very spiritual, and it helps you understand others and the other, and it helps you understand how important everything is, how important we are as people, and how can everybody become an important part, a creative part of something. So that's how I see it.
And I think it's in that spirit of creativity, crossing all of these different genres and disciplines. We've ranged from visual to soundscape. We've talked about ideas, and we've talked about social justice. But it's with truly powerful creatives like these two that we can think about how we put all of those pieces back together, back into that symbiosis, and create a more powerful collaboration and a more positive future. So thank you both for your time today and for sharing your thoughts and your creativity. And thank you so much to all of you for joining us, submitting your questions, sharing your attention, and thinking and spending time together.
Thank you.
Thank you.